When people think about their plants, the first thing that they will probably think about is how do you water your plants? There's a good reason for that actually, because watering your plant is probably the place where most people make the biggest mistake, and it's actually the cause of why most plants will actually not survive. At the same time, it's something that you'll have to do regularly for your plants if you want them to survive. So it's necessary, but it's also a place where a lot of people go wrong. So in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can figure out when your plant needs water and how to give it enough water so that you won't run into a situation where your plant is going to be unhappy. So in my opinion, there are 3 ways where you can directly measure when your plant will need water. And maybe one way you can kind of get a sense of, or maybe like 1 or 2 ways you can get a sense of or a general feel of how much water your plant is going to be needing, if you need to increase the frequency or if you're okay to let it dry out for a bit. Let's talk about the ways you can measure if your plant needs water directly first. So first, the way you can check it out is by actually weighing your plant. This is kind of something that you'll get a feel of as you water your plant. But one way you can check if your plant needs water is to just pick it up and see if you can feel the water content in the soil. Because if you remember, water actually is pretty heavy. If you imagine like a gallon of water and try to pick it up, that's actually a significant amount of weight. That's probably like 5 or 6 pounds right there. So if you keep that in mind, when you water your plants, it's actually going to be a considerable amount of weight that you've just added to your soil. If you pick up a plant that's been well watered, you're definitely going to feel that weight compared to a plant that's been completely dried up. The soil's completely dry. There's no water in there. That type of plant is going to feel lighter. And so every time you pick up your plant at home, you just kind of get a feel for this. You'll kind of tell when your plant has been watered or when the soil's been kind of dried out and could use a little bit more water. So that's the first way you can directly measure if your plant needs water. The second way you can tell is to actually feel the soil. And I guess there's kind of 2 parts to this. So one way you can tell, you can actually just stick your finger into the soil and you'll actually feel if the soil is moist or if it's dry. That's just one way you can kind of sense the moisture content in your soil. The other way you could do it is you can grab a pair of chopsticks or just one piece of chopstick and just stick it down in the soil and pull it back out. If your soil is moist and has been well watered, you'll actually see the dirt start to stick to the chopstick. But for a plant that has a dried out soil, there actually won't be that much dirt that sticks to the chopstick, and that's because of the capillary effect. Water kind of creates an attractive force between things that are kind of wet, especially when you're looking at like really small particles, like the size of millimeters or even micrometers. Those are going to create strong attractive forces on the molecules and cause them to stick together, and so that's why you'll see dirt sticking to things when it's a bit more moist compared to when it's dry. The third way you can directly measure the water content in your soil is to get a moisture meter. And there are a lot of different moisture meters you can get online, but generally how they work is you stick it in the soil and it'll give you a number that will tell you the moisture content in your soil. And you can take the measurements before and after you've watered your plant just to get an idea of what kind of numbers will indicate when your plants are running a little low on water, or if it's still pretty high, you don't need to water it for a couple of weeks. And that's the third way you can directly measure how much moisture is in your soil. And let's talk about a couple of ways where you can get a general idea of how much water your plant is going to be needing. So one way you can tell this is if your plant's been experiencing a lot of growth. Because if you think about it, when a plant is actually doing a lot of growing, it takes energy to do that and a lot of different nutrients and minerals to create those cellular molecules needed to create plant growth. And anytime something involves spending energy, water is going to be required. And so when a plant does a lot of growing, that means it's going to be using up a lot of water. And so what that means for you is if you notice that your plant is doing some growing, use that as kind of a cue that maybe this plant is going to be needing more water or is going to be needing to be watered more frequently. The second way you can get a feel of how much water your plant is going to need is to just do some research on the specific type of plant that you have. So this one's kind of like a no-brainer, but if you just do a little bit of research on what type of plant you have, that's going to give you pretty directly how much water it's going to be needing. And this is especially important if you're working with a plant that you haven't had experience with. So like different classes of plant species like succulents or ferns or even water-based plants, knowing the type of conditions that they prefer, where they come from, how much water they tend to be needing, that's going to give you kind of an idea of how much water you should expect to be given this plant. That can especially come in handy when you're out shopping for plants, because that'll help you pick out which plants might work best for your situation based on how much you prefer watering your plants. And so just doing a little bit of research, doing a little bit of legwork, that's going to save you a bunch of hassle from trying to guess how much water your plant is going to need. The third factor you might want to think about when watering your plants is actually the size of the pot that your plant is growing in. Just really quickly, bigger pots hold on to moisture longer because bigger pots will mean there's less surface area for water to evaporate. And this is kind of a geometry thing, but smaller particles, really small particles, have a lot of surface area compared to larger particles that have lower surface area. Surface area grows on a quadratic scale while volume grows on a cubic scale. And so what that means as you increase the size of your particle or size of whatever volume you're looking at, the surface area is going to grow way slower than the volume. Long story short, bigger volume means more water is going to be in that volume, but less of it is going to be exposed to surface area where it can evaporate. And so that means bigger pots are going to hold on to water longer. Kind of a long explanation, but that's bottom line is bigger pots need to be watered less frequently. And kind of along those lines, the fourth way you can get a general idea of when your plant needs water is what type of pot you're using. This kind of comes down to two categories. So one is terracotta pots or ceramic pots, and the other is plastic pots or any type of pot that prevents water from passing through that barrier and evaporating. So terracotta pots allow water to get absorbed into the pot and evaporate out the sides, whereas plastic pots contain the water and they don't let it evaporate out the sides. With terracotta pots, you're going to have to water your plant a little bit more often than a plastic pot. So just another thing to keep in mind. Another way you can get a feel for how much water your plant needs is if it's outdoors or indoors. So outdoor plants will need to be watered more frequently. Indoor plants need to be watered less frequently because outdoor there's an air current flowing around because of the wind, and it's also being exposed to direct sunlight, which heats up the water, makes it evaporate more quickly. So outdoor plants will need to be watered more frequently than an indoor plant. So now that we got that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about how to water your plants. When you're watering your plants, it depends on what type of pot you have, kind of same thing. What it really depends on is if your pot has drainage holes. If your pot has drainage holes, the way that you water your plants is you're going to want to water it until water pours out the bottom. And that's how you know that water has completely saturated your plant soil. And depending on how much water you want to give your plants, you could do this multiple times, like 2 or 3 passes of water flowing out the bottom. Or you can just do it once and you can stop the first time you see water coming out the bottom. If your pot doesn't have any drainage holes, then you're probably going to want to be really careful and not give it as much water. Because if you give it too much water, that water is going to stay stagnant and it's actually going to drown your plant almost. It's going to cause your plant to be suffocated of oxygen, and it's going to cause the roots to start rotting and dying off, which is going to ultimately end up with your plant dying. The most common reason why plants actually die off is because the owners will overwater their plants. Another way you can water your plant is to bottom water it. So I've done this once for my snake plant. Basically how this works is add in a bunch of water into a container or your pot or some kind of tray, and you put your plant, assuming that it has drainage holes at the bottom, you put that into the water and just let it sit there and allow the water to soak up through the bottom of those drainage holes. And you're gonna let it sit there for maybe about 30 minutes or so, kind of depends on how much water it needs. But you're just gonna let it sit there for 30 minutes, maybe an hour, set a timer, walk away, and then you come back and you're gonna take it out. And that'll give it enough time for the water to soak up through the bottom of the drainage holes and into the plant soil. And that's actually a great way to prevent any fungus gnats from infesting your plants, because if you keep the top layer dry, there's not gonna be any place for those fungus gnats to lay their eggs and reproduce, because they really love that moisture. So if you keep the top layer dry, you're going to be less likely to be bothered by fungus gnats. Now let's talk a little bit about the frequency. So frequency, in my experience, for plants that don't need to be watered that much, like my snake plant, I only water it like once every 1 or 2 months, and it seems to be doing fine. So every time I do water it, I do water it thoroughly, but between waterings, I let it dry out. I think about 1 or 2 months is good enough to let it dry between waterings. And my snake plant has been doing fine with that watering frequency. With other types of plants, I'd say water maybe once every 2 or 3 weeks if it needs a moderate amount of water. And plants that need a lot of water, you probably need to water them once a week. And there's a whole bunch of variables that play into this, but that's just kind of a rule of thumb. General kind of ballpark numbers that you might want to be thinking about how often to water your plants. If you follow those guidelines, there's a very good chance that your plant is going to be survivable. Just want to put a little bit of a disclaimer here. Plants know how to take care of themselves, so don't worry too much about getting watering frequency, the watering amount, getting that perfect exactly on the number of days down to the hour, measuring out the exact number of milliliters that you need to add to your plant. As long as you give it a kind of a rough amount of water that's in the ballpark of what they're looking for, your plant is probably going to be doing fine. A little bit of variation here and there isn't really going to make much of a difference. But as long as you follow those guidelines, your plant will probably do fine. But that's it for this video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.